Well, hello class, this is Mr. Mormon. Welcome to our first video in our unit on cells. Today we're going to be doing just a brief introduction to some of the concepts that we will need for this unit. So let's start by discussing what a cell is. Cells are the building blocks of life. They're the smallest units of structure and function in a living thing. If you look at this diagram here, we see a person's thumb. As we zoom in and magnify, we can see more detail. And as we move smaller and magnify further, we can see all the tiny little cells that the person is made of. Like the individual bricks in this building, living things are made up of individual cells. And what's true for animals, that they're made up of cells like you and me and this giraffe, plants are as well. All living things are made of cells. Here's a very highly magnified view of a plant cell. Here's the definition you can copy down. Cells are the basic unit of structure and function in all living things. Here's another way to look at it. This is showing the levels of organization within the human body. Starting down at the atomic level, atoms group together to form molecules, including macromolecules like DNA, which we see here. They can then form together to make the organelles, which are inside cells. Now, the cell is the basic whole unit of a living basic unit of a living thing. So the cell is the basic unit of structure and function. Now, a group of the same kind of cells all working together makes a tissue. Different tissues will work together to create an organ. Several organs would be then part of an organ system. Like here we see the stomach, which is part of the digestive system. You put all the organ systems together and you have an entire organism. So let's copy down in our notes the levels of organization. So we'll start with cells down at the bottom. Cells are grouped into tissues. Some examples of tissues would be skin tissue, muscle tissue, brain tissue. Even blood is considered a tissue because it's made up of cells. Many tissues will form together to create an organ, like your heart. Your heart contains muscle tissue, there's nerve tissue in there, there's connective tissue holding it all together. It creates an organ. Organs are then part of organ systems. When you put all the organ systems together, you create the entire organism. Here we see a timeline of the history of the discovery of the cell and some of the pioneering scientists who had a lot to do with the discovery of the cell and creating the cell theory. The most important early discoveries in the cell were made by two gentlemen at around the same time, Robert Hooke and Anton von Leeuwenhoek. The very first microscopes had been invented at the very end of the 1500s, the early 1600s. Hooke and Leeuwenhoek started doing a lot of research and looking into cells. Robert Hooke used his microscope to make drawings like these, which came from cork. He thought the cells looked like cells in a prison or something like that, like rooms in a prison, and he's the one who gave us the name cell. And around the same time, the Dutchman Leeuwenhoek was looking at pond water with his very simple microscope that looked like this. He would place a specimen here on this point. The lens was right there. He would hold it up to the light and he could see the very small microorganisms swimming around in the pond water. After lots of research by many scientists, and particularly by these guys here, Matthias Schleiden, Theodor Schwann, and Rudolf Virchow, it was determined that all plants and all animals were made up of cells. It was Schleiden who had done the work with plants and Schwann who had done the work with animals. But the conclusion was that all living things were made up of cells. Rudolf Virchow contributed the final piece to the cell theory, that cells can only come from existing cells, that life has to come from life. So let's write down the three main ideas of the cell theory. One, all living things are composed of cells. All plants, all animals, all microscopic organisms, they're all made up of cells. And the cell is the basic unit, in other words, the smallest building block. It's the basic unit of structure and function in all living things. And that new cells are only produced from existing cells. Life has to come from life. There's no such thing as spontaneous generation. Here's a quick overview of the history of the microscope, starting with the very first compound microscopes at the end of the 1500s, and the simple microscopes used in the 1600s by Hooke and Leeuwenhoek to make the early discoveries about cells, up into here's the first microscopes that look similar to the ones that we use today, modern compound light microscopes, it's very similar to the ones we use in the classroom. They used a mirror, where ours have an electric light. These use a mirror to bounce sunlight up into the specimen so you can see it clearly. And then there's the invention of electron microscopes, and there's different kinds. The transmission electron microscope, the scanning electron microscope, and the scanning tunneling electron microscope. These can magnify much, much greater than a light microscope can because they use electrons instead of the wavelength of light. And electrons are much smaller than the wavelength of light, so you can see much greater detail and much higher resolution, up to 1,000,000 times resolution, whereas a light microscope can only get up to about 1,000 times magnification. Okay, so as we've mentioned, cells, there are some living things that are just made up of a single cell. Those would be unicellular organisms. And then there's other cells that only function when they are part of a multicellular organism. So let's get these definitions down. Unicellular organisms would have only one cell. Multicellular means it's an organism with many cells. Humans, for example, as an adults, we would have somewhere on the order of 75 trillion cells in our body. Now, there's many different types of unicellular organisms. Here we see bacteria. They're the simplest of organisms, living things on Earth, and they come in different shapes. Cocci are round. Bacilli are rod-shaped. Coccobacilli are in rods that are in chains. We see streptococci, which are the round ones that are in chains. We see spirilla. So they're identified by their shape. Not all bacteria are bad. Here's a very highly magnified picture taken with an electron microscope of Lactobacillus acidophilus. That's a very good bacteria to have in you, to eat and have in your digestive system. They help you with digestion. This is the bacteria that is used to turn milk into yogurt, and yogurt is full of that bacteria, and it's very healthy for you. Now, these microorganisms are protists. Protists are very often found in water. You'd find them in ponds and lakes and swamps. You'd also find them in salt water. They're tiny little microscopic organisms that are either free swimming or attached to the bottom. Some are photosynthetic and get their energy from the sun, and others, they eat each other to get their energy. They form the base of the food chains in marine environments. There's even unicellular fungi. These are yeast cells. Something interesting that you can see here is that some of these cells are in the process of dividing. They've got these little bumps on them that are growing into new yeast cells. That's called budding. Now, another classification that's often used in identifying cells is prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells. Prokaryotic cells would be things like bacteria. These are the most ancient types of cells. They evolved first, and they have no nucleus. The DNA is just floating around inside the cell. Eukaryotic cells have their DNA organized and contained inside a nucleus. Here we can see what I'm talking about. This is a bacterial cell, prokaryotic. It has no nucleus. The DNA is just floating around here in the cytoplasm. This animal cell and plant cell are both eukaryotic because they have a nucleus. Now, multicellular organisms are going to have specialized cells that perform special functions. They're also going to have interesting shapes sometimes. This is a nerve cell. Here are some red blood cells. These are human bone cells, each with their own special shape and function. Now, like the organs in your body, a cell's organelles carry out all of its life processes. These would be the 10 GERs: transport, excretion, nutrition, growth, reproduction, respiration, regulation, synthesis. All controlled or taken care of by those organelles inside the cell. Inside your body, it's your organs. So there's a good comparison there between multicellular organisms and single-celled organisms, what's going on inside. The organelles are analogous to the organs and taking care of a lot of the important tasks that need to be taken care of for a living thing, like removing waste and building proteins, converting food into energy. Animal cells and plant cells are going to have a lot of the same features. When we look at them under the microscope, we're going to see a lot of similarities. We'll notice there's cell membranes in both, that there's a nucleus, that there's cytoplasm, there's DNA. These are all things that will be the same in both an animal cell and a plant cell. There's also going to be some important differences. This plant cell has a large water vacuole that the animal cell does not. The plant cell has a boxy shape, a green color. It has a cell wall around the outside. It's got chloroplasts, all things the animal cell does not. The animal cell has lysosomes, though, which are for digestion. Since the plant is making its own food, it does not need lysosomes. And I want to finish up with mitosis. Mitosis is cell division. This is how cells, they copy their DNA and split. One cell becomes two. For single-celled organisms, mitosis is for reproduction. One bacteria cell will copy its DNA and split to become two. Two becomes four. Four becomes 8, 16, 32, on and on and on. In multicellular organisms, mitosis is for growth and repair. That's how we get bigger. We make more cells. And also cells get damaged. Cells wear out. Cells die. When you get a scrape, a cut, a broken bone, you need to make new cells. That's where mitosis comes in. All right, that's it for this video. If you have any questions, please bring them up in class tomorrow.